In the summer of 1941, a government engineer drove into a hollow in eastern Tennessee to survey land for a new dam. He found an old man sitting on a porch, reading the sky. The engineer pulled out his instruments, his charts, his barometers. The old man looked up once and said, "Do not bother setting up camp. Rain comes by morning, and it will not stop for 3 days." The engineer laughed. By noon the next day, the creek had risen 6 feet and washed the government truck into the river. Number 22 on this list is the skill that old man used, and it has never once been taught in any school anywhere in America. Number 9 was declared a federal violation in 1931, yet hospitals in 4 states quietly used it on patients until the 1980s. And number 1, the last living person who truly mastered it, passed away in a small town in North Carolina just 2 years ago, and he never wrote a single word of it down. These are not folklore. These are not myths. These are 25 survival skills from the Appalachian Mountains that took 300 years to build and 1 generation to almost completely destroy. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Let us count down all 25. Number 25. Hand-split chestnut fence rails. Before wire fencing existed, every farm in the Appalachian Highlands was bordered by what locals called a worm fence, built entirely from American chestnut rails split by hand with an iron wedge and a wooden mallet. A skilled man could split 150 rails in a single day from a single log, and those rails would lock together without a single nail, holding their shape against ice storms and flooding cattle for 60 years or more. The geometry was everything. Each rail crossed the next at a precise angle that created tension instead of weakness, and the whole structure held itself up by nothing but weight and friction. When the chestnut blight swept through the mountains between 1910 and 1940, it killed every American chestnut tree on the continent, and the knowledge of how to build these fences correctly died with the trees. What survives today are the ghostly zigzag lines of rotting rails across old pastures, and almost nobody alive can explain exactly why they were laid the way they were. Ask yourself, how many other things were built perfectly for centuries before we stopped asking why they worked? Number 24. Wildcat grist milling on moving water. Every creek in the southern mountains once had at least one small water-powered mill built and operated by a single family, not a company, not a government, one man and his sons. These wildcat mills ground corn into meal, wheat into flour, and rye into feed, and the miller read the speed of the water the same way a modern engineer reads a gauge, by sound, by feel, and by the spray off the wheel. A good miller knew that the grind changed with the season because the water temperature affected the consistency of the meal, and he adjusted the gap between his stones accordingly, never measuring, always listening. The mills are gone now. Most of them collapsed or buried under reservoir water when the Tennessee Valley Authority dammed the creeks in the 1930s and 40s. But here is what nobody talks about. The families who lost their mills also lost their independence overnight, and some of them never recovered economically in their lifetimes. What does it mean when a technology disappears and takes an entire way of living with it? Number 23. Black walnut hull dye and ink. In every mountain cabin before the Civil War, the ink in the family Bible was almost certainly made from black walnut hulls, and the dye on the homespun wool hanging by the fireplace came from the same source. The process required harvesting the green outer hulls before they turned black, boiling them down in iron kettles for 4 to 6 hours, and treating the resulting liquid with a mordant of rusted iron shavings soaked in vinegar for 2 weeks. The color produced was a permanent, deep brown black that bonded to fiber at the molecular level and never faded. Not in sunlight, not in washing, not in 100 years of use. Textile museums today pay thousands of dollars for mountain quilts dyed this way, because modern synthetic dyes simply cannot replicate the depth of the color. The women who knew the exact ratios of hull to water to iron mordant passed that knowledge to their daughters by hand, standing over the same kettles, measuring by smell and by the color of the steam. That chain of transmission is broken now. What else have we lost that we do not even know we are missing? Number 22. Reading weather from ridge and creek. The old man from the opening of this video was not guessing. He was reading a system that mountain people had been refining for over 200 years. A combination of ridge cloud behavior, creek sound, animal movement, and wind direction that together told a skilled observer exactly what the weather would do over the next 72 hours. A low white mist clinging to the north shoulder of a ridge at dusk meant heavy rain within 36 hours without exception. A particular change in the sound of moving water, a lower, heavier tone that experienced ears could hear a quarter-mile away, meant pressure was dropping fast. Crows moving off the high ridges before noon meant cold was coming in from the northwest by nightfall. A study published out of Appalachian State University in 1994 found that experienced mountain farmers outperformed local television weather forecasts on 3-day predictions by a margin that the researchers described as statistically significant and deeply uncomfortable. The men who could read the ridges are mostly gone. Their grandchildren check phone apps that are wrong 30% of the time. Think about that for a moment. Number 21. Bark tanning with chestnut and hemlock. Mountain leather was not soft because mountain people were gentle. It was soft because they understood chemistry 4 generations before anyone gave it that name. A hide tanner in the Appalachian tradition used a combination of crushed chestnut bark and hemlock bark soaked in creek water to create a tanning liquor so rich in tannins that a single cowhide could be fully processed in 3 weeks instead of the 3 months required by other methods. The tanner controlled the process by taste, touching his finger to the liquor and reading the astringency on his tongue to know whether the tannin concentration was right. The resulting leather was waterproof, flexible at temperatures well below freezing, and resistant to rot in a way that modern chrome-tanned leather is not. Boots made from Appalachian bark-tanned leather lasted 20 years of hard mountain use. The craft died with the chestnut trees, since hemlock alone does not produce the same result, and nobody alive today knows the exact ratio of the 2 bark blend that made the mountain leather what it was. Some knowledge, once broken, cannot simply be looked up. Number 20. Sung root cultivation and ethical harvest. Wild ginseng, called sang in the hollows, has been one of the most valuable plants in North America since the 1700s, when Chinese merchants paid in gold for roots shipped from the Appalachian highlands. A proper sang hunter did not simply dig. He maintained patches the way a farmer maintains fields, replanting every berry from every root he harvested, marking his best patches with landmarks known only to himself and his sons, and rotating his harvest so no patch was touched more than once every 4 years. The root he pulled was worth more money the older it was, and he knew that a root with 5 prongs represented at least 40 years of growth in the mountain soil. A single prime root in good condition sold for over $800 per pound in 2023. But the knowledge of how to harvest without destroying the patch, the knowledge that made sustainable harvest possible for 2 centuries, is dying faster than the plants themselves. Commercial diggers strip hillsides clean in a single afternoon, not understanding that they are destroying 40 years of growth for a single season of profit. Is there a lesson in that for industries beyond ginseng? Number 19. The art of making hominy without machinery. Long before nutritional science existed, mountain grandmothers had solved a problem that would not be formally identified by researchers until the 20th century. Dried corn, eaten without treatment, locks its niacin so tightly in its fiber that the human body cannot absorb it, leading to a disease called pellagra that devastated populations across the American South who ate cornbread but not hominy. The mountain women who knew the old way soaked their dried corn in a strong solution of wood ash lye for 2 full days, rinsed it 7 times in cold spring water, and produced a swollen, softened kernel that released its nutrients completely during digestion. The chemistry involved, called nixtamalization, was not named or described by scientists until the 1930s, but mountain families had been practicing it for over 200 years without ever hearing the word. The women who knew the process knew it by feel and smell, not by formula. They knew when the holes were slipping right, when the lye had been fully rinsed out, when the hominy was ready to dry. That sensory knowledge is almost entirely gone from American kitchens today. What else do we do by formula that our grandmothers did by wisdom? Number 18. Coverlet weaving on 4-harness floor looms. Every mountain household of any standing before the Civil War contained a 4-harness floor loom that stood 6 feet tall, weighed 300 pounds, and could produce a coverlet so complex in its pattern that modern textile scholars study them under magnification, trying to reverse engineer the threading sequence. The woman who ran that loom held the entire draft, the hundreds of threading decisions that determined the final pattern, entirely in her memory. She did not write it down. She threaded her loom from memory the way a musician plays from memory, and she modified her patterns season by season based on the yarn she had available. The draft she carried died when she died. Museums across Tennessee and North Carolina own coverlets from the 1840s that no living weaver can fully replicate because the threading sequence has never been successfully reverse engineered. Textile scholars have been trying for 30 years. Think about what it means that something made by a woman in a mountain cabin with no formal education contains a technical complexity that defeats modern researchers. Number 17. Foraging and preserving ramps through winter. Ramps are wild mountain leeks that emerge for 3 weeks in April on damp hardwood slopes, and the Appalachian families who relied on them developed a preservation system that made a 3-week harvest last all 12 months. After pulling only the leaf tops and leaving the bulbs intact so the patch regrew the following year, the women dried the leaves on wooden racks over the wood stove for 30 days until they were papery and could be crumbled into beans and soups through the fall and winter. A separate batch was pickled in brine in stone crocks with dried pepper and kept in the root cellar for up to 18 months without spoiling. The flavor concentrated during drying and became something entirely different from the fresh leaf, a deep, savory intensity that mountain cooks use the way modern cooks use fish sauce or aged cheese. The wild patches where families harvested for generations are disappearing now because commercial buyers pull the whole bulb for restaurant markets, killing the patch permanently in a single season. And the knowledge of how to dry and preserve ramps correctly so they hold their flavor through winter is almost entirely lost. A question worth sitting with. When the last wild patch is gone, who will know it mattered? Number 16. Splitting and weaving white oak basket splits. The craft of white oak basket weaving as practiced in the southern Appalachian was not a folk art hobby. It was a precision technical skill that began with selecting the exact right tree, a straight-grained white oak of exactly the right age, splitting it along the grain with a froe and a mallet into splits so thin they could be bent double without cracking, and then weaving those splits into baskets so tight they held water without any waterproofing treatment. The critical skill was in the splitting. A master splitter could produce splits of perfectly uniform thickness by feel alone, running his thumb along the grain to detect variations invisible to the eye and redirecting the split accordingly. The baskets they produced were used for everything from carrying water to storing grain to gathering apples, and a well-made white oak basket lasted 50 years of hard daily use. The Cherokee practiced this craft for centuries before European settlers arrived and learned it from them. Today, fewer than 24 active white oak basket makers remain in the entire mountain range, most of them over 70 years old. When they are gone, the craft is gone. There is no institution preserving it. There is no certification program. There is just a small group of old hands and a skill that took 1,000 years to develop. Number 15. Reading a persimmon seed to forecast winter. Every October, farm families across the southern mountains would cut open a ripe persimmon seed with a sharp knife and study the shape of the kernel inside. A spoon shape meant heavy, wet, shovel-requiring snow. A knife shape meant sharp, cutting cold with little snow. A fork shape meant a mild winter with light, powdery snowfall. The Agricultural Extension Office of the University of Missouri published a study in 2011 that tracked persimmon seed predictions against official National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration forecasts for 20 consecutive years. The persimmon seeds were more accurate. The working theory is that the tree's seed development responds to late summer soil temperature and atmospheric moisture, and those conditions directly correlate with the winter weather patterns that follow. But here is the part that should stop you cold. The last time a major American newspaper ran a persimmon seed forecast as a serious news story was 1962. In 60 years, we went from printing it to laughing at it. What changed? The trees or us? Number 14. Cold smoking meat without refrigeration for long-term storage. The Appalachian smokehouse was not a barbecue setup. It was a preservation technology that kept families alive through winters where the nearest store was a 2-day walk in good weather and an impassable road in bad weather. The process began in November at hog killing time, when shoulders, hams, and bellies were packed into wooden troughs with a precise mixture of salt, brown sugar, and black pepper, rubbed by hand into every surface and crevice for a full hour, then buried in salt for 1.5 days per pound of meat. The temperature had to remain between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit during the curing period. Too warm and the meat spoiled from the inside out. Too cold and the salt did not penetrate. After curing came 30 days of cold hickory and applewood smoke, never pine, never greenwood, and then a full year of hanging before the ham was considered properly aged and ready to eat. An experienced salt curer could press his thumb into the center of a curing ham and tell by the resistance alone whether the cure had penetrated correctly to the bone. That tactile knowledge, built through years of pressing thousands of hams, is as gone as the smokehouses themselves. How many things do we now buy in plastic that our great-grandparents made to last 2 years without power? Number 13. Hickory bark chair seat weaving. The classic Appalachian ladderback chair, the kind that still shows up in antique shops and roadside stands across the mountain south, was meant to have its seat woven from hand-split hickory bark, not from the flat reed or twisted paper cord that modern reproductions use. The hickory bark had to be stripped in May, when the sap was running and the bark released cleanly from the wood, then soaked in a creek for 2 weeks to keep it pliable, then shaved to uniform thickness with a draw knife, then woven over and under the chair rails in a herringbone pattern that took 6 hours to complete correctly. A properly woven hickory seat held 400 pounds and lasted 80 years without repair or replacement. Each chairmaker who knew the old way had a slightly different signature in how he turned the final split at the corner of the seat, a detail so individual that furniture historians can sometimes identify a maker's work across different chairs, separated by decades. Fewer than a dozen craftsmen in the entire mountain range still weave the old way today. When the last one stops working, the signature disappears with him. Number 12. Wild medicinal herb timing and preparation. Long before any pharmacy existed in the mountain hollows, a skilled herb woman knew not just which plants to gather, but exactly when in the season to gather them, from which part of the plant, at what time of day, and how to prepare them for different conditions. White willow bark, harvested from second-year growth in early spring and brewed to a precise amber color, contained enough salicin to reduce fever and relieve pain, the same compound that Bayer synthesized into aspirin in 1899. Boneset, gathered in late summer before the first frost, was used for fever and joint pain. Yellow root, dug in fall, was used as an antibiotic rinse for mouth sores and infected wounds. Researchers at Emory University are currently documenting the last of these herb traditions from elderly Cherokee and Scots-Irish healers before they die, because the knowledge of preparation, the specific combinations of harvest timing, plant part, and brewing method that made these remedies effective rather than merely symbolic, exists in almost no written record anywhere. The healers learned it from their mothers at age 8, standing in fields at dawn, and it has been transmitted that way for 200 years. That chain is breaking now, one funeral at a time. Number 11. Sorghum syrup making and the stir-off tradition. Every fall across the mountain south, entire communities gathered for the sorghum stir-off, a day-long event built around the boiling of sorghum cane juice into syrup in a long, shallow, evaporating pan over a wood fire. The syrup maker, always the most experienced person present, stood at the pan for hours skimming green foam from the surface with a flat wooden paddle while reading the color of the boiling liquid as it moved from pale yellow-green through gold to the deep amber that meant the syrup was ready. Pull it too early and it was thin and sour. Pull it 5 minutes too late and it crystallized in the jar within a week. The moment of perfect pull was identified entirely by color, smell, and the way the syrup sheeted off the edge of the paddle when lifted, not by thermometer, not by timer. 1 gallon of finished sorghum required 10 gallons of fresh cane juice and 4 decades of standing over that pan to know exactly what you were looking at. Today, perhaps 30 active sorghum makers remain across all of Appalachia. Most of them are over 65. What happens to a community event when the last person who knows how to run it is gone? Number 10. Building and reading a Beegum hive. Long before the modern Langstroth box hive became the standard for American beekeeping, mountain families kept their honeybees in what they called Beegums, sections of naturally hollow black gum tree trunk, about 3 feet long and 18 inches across, set on a flat board with a notch cut near the bottom for the flight entrance, and nothing else. No frames, no foundation, no wax guides. The bees built their comb in the natural free-hanging curves that their instincts demanded, and the beekeeper managed the colony entirely by listening and smelling. A low, steady hum meant the colony was strong and the queen was laying. A high, restless tone meant something was wrong, possibly a failing queen or a coming swarm. The smell at the entrance told an experienced keeper whether the bees were bringing in nectar or consuming their stores. The last known active Beegum keeper in Madison County, North Carolina, died in 2022. He tended his hives without gloves or smoke because he understood the bees rather than subduing them. And he could hold his bare hand over the entrance of a hive and tell you the weather 3 days ahead by the frequency of the wing vibration alone. Modern research published in 2019 found that natural comb Beegum colonies show significantly higher resistance to the varroa mite, the pest currently destroying commercial honeybee populations across North America. The knowledge died 2 years ago. The research confirming it was right came out 3 years before he passed. He never knew his bees were proving the scientists right. Number 9. Lie. Soap making from wood ash and animal fat. Every spring across the mountain hollows, grandmothers dragged out a wooden hopper, packed it with white oak ashes saved all winter from the fireplace, and poured soft rainwater through it, one drop at a time, until a liquid dripped from the bottom that was so concentrated with potassium hydroxide that it would float a fresh egg. This was a lie, and it was the foundation of the mountain cleaning and medicine tradition. Rendered hog fat was added to the lye in a cast iron kettle over a slow outdoor fire and stirred continuously with a wooden paddle for 3 to 4 hours until the mixture hit what soap makers call trace, a pudding-thick consistency that meant the saponification was complete. The resulting soft soap cleaned floors, washed clothes, treated skin infections, killed lice, softened calluses, and preserved leather. The lye concentration had to be exact, too weak and the soap never set, too strong and it burned through cloth and skin both. The grandmothers tested it by feel and by the egg test and by a small taste on the tip of the finger, a boldness that modern safety culture would find alarming and that worked without fail for 200 years. When did we trade instinctual knowledge for instruction labels, and was it entirely a trade worth making? Number 1. The Beegum beekeeper who knew the hive by sound. We return to where we began. Not with a technique, not with a recipe, not with a building method, but with a man. He lived in Madison County, North Carolina, in a hollow that his family had farmed for 7 generations. He kept his bees in Beegum hives, sections of hollow black gum trunk, and he tended them without gloves or smoke or any protective equipment because he did not manage the bees by subduing them. He managed them by understanding them. He could walk to a Beegum on any morning and tell you within minutes whether the colony was strong or struggling, whether the queen was laying or failing, whether a swarm was coming, and what the weather would do in the next 3 days, using nothing but his ears and the nerve endings in his bare hands. He never wrote any of it down. He said the knowledge lived in the hands and could not survive in words. He passed in 2022. His son did not keep bees. His grandchildren live in a city 4 hours away. The knowledge he carried, refined across 7 generations of the same family on the same land, is gone. Not rare, not endangered, gone. And here's the thing that should stay with you long after this video ends. He knew it was going. He watched it go. And the question he asked, quietly, to the researchers who came to him in his last years, was not why did no one come sooner to learn. It was simpler than that. He asked whether anyone would notice once it was quiet. The answer to that question is the one you carry out of this video with you. Leave a comment telling us which of these 25 skills your family still carries, even partially, even imperfectly. Because every piece of this that survives lives only as long as someone remembers to pass it on.